Welcome to Popternative, where we dive into topical discussions from the worlds of pop culture, social media, and sports. Here is your host, Peter Remoliotis, aka PD Beats.
Hello and welcome to the Popternative podcast. This is the podcast where we have digital discussions in the worlds of sports, pop culture, social media, and yes, hockey. We love hockey here on Popternative. Really excited to have NHL prospects writer from the Athletic, Corey Pronman, is on my show. Corey, welcome to Popternative, man.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me, Peter.
No problem. Before we get into prospects, and because the World Juniors just wrapped up, so we have a lot to talk about in that regard. But when did you kind of decide that you wanted to, scout and thoroughly analyze hockey players? Like when did you kind of decide you wanted to do that? Did you first decide you maybe want to go like in the journalism, specifically like writing articles, or when did you kind of get into scouting?
My first writing job actually was more stats based. I got hired initially by Hockey Prospectus to do kind of analytics work for them. But I was always a big baseball fan at the time. And I was a big reader of Keith Law, then at ESPN, and Kevin Goldstein, then at Baseball Prospectus, who now works for the Houston Astros. And especially from Keith, I saw a guy who can blend both the analytics and the scouting perspectives into being a good player evaluator. And I took a lot of inspiration from that. So when I was working at Hockey Prospectus, I pitched them the idea of, since they had like 10 analytics writers, of me going more into trying to blend scouting and stats into prospect analysis. And they really bought into that. And kind of just snowballed. Actually, they weren't even going to bring me back at one point. But then after I pitched them that idea, they liked it and they brought me back. And it kind of took off from there. And I saw an area that wasn't filled in the hockey world, which, there's plenty of people who write about prospect, people who scout, but there wasn't a lot of people who, one, was very analytically minded when it comes to prospects and scouting, and two, there wasn't a lot of people who covered the entire prospect world, like from junior to the American League. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of and I kind of thought that would be an interesting niche to fill. And, kind of over the last 10 years, that's basically what I've been doing.
So I find that interesting. About the aspect that, hockey prospects and scouting is still considered like a niche market. What do you think of the current landscape and the current state of hockey prospects and covering hockey prospects? Do you think that it's become more saturated? Is there still a need for more, up and coming journalists to kind of start blogs and give these kids the exposure? Like, what do you think about the current state of hockey, like hockey scouting for NHL drafts? Because there's so much content out there right now.
It's getting better. I would still say it's niche to an extent. You still see the same 3 or 4 faces whenever you go to certain rinks. And as well, like I said, I think there's a heavy focus on the draft still, but honestly, part of why I think I've been able to make a career out of this, at least so far, has been because there's not really anybody else doing work in the drafted prospect area. Not to say there's not people doing it, but it's much less than the alternative. There are people, people cover prospects for their teams, but there's very few people who will comprehensively cover prospects from after they get drafted. That means watching them in college, watching them in the American League, watching them throughout their training camp processes. I don't see many scouting services going into American League rinks when I go there. So I think that's it's still a growing market. And I think you look what baseball has done, you look at the success of sites like Baseball America, which have, hired like dozens and hundreds of writers and can comprehensively cover the entire baseball farm systems. I can see that happening eventually in hockey, but it hasn't happened yet. Hockey's future shut down. I hope it gets there at one point. I'd love to see more people out in the rinks. I'd love to see more interesting coverage. Yeah. And I think that is starting, especially when you compare it to where it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but it's still a growing market.
No, absolutely. For a lot of people that follow your work and follow you on Twitter and read your stuff, they're going to kind of see that a lot of your analyzing is very thorough. There's a lot of detail. And is that, and I think it's funny because you mentioned baseball, because we all know, baseball, it's really stats driven and everything. Is that what makes a good prospect reporter in your mind, being very thorough, not just saying, hey, the guy's a good skater? I mean, everyone's going to say that, right? But how does he skate? did he work on his skating? And I get that from your writing, and I find that really interesting.
There's a few things I think that makes not only a good report, but a good evaluator. I think there's a couple of key elements. The one I think most important is kind of a philosophy of what exactly do you want in a player. I find often, not all the time, but I find often that most evaluators will agree to a large extent on what a player's strengths and weaknesses are. That's not always the case. There's definitely arguments we've had along the way over many years over several players, but I think the overwhelming amount of time that's the case. We agree that a certain player is a good or bad skater, he is or is not skilled, so on and so forth. That the big disagreements come when you find two players that you agree on a skill set, but you disagree on how valuable that skill set is. And I think that comes to really understanding what's valuable in the NHL, what projects well into the NHL, and I think that that comes from really studying the game for a long period of time, researching what is important in a player, and that requires a different kind of level of detail than just the scouting detail. Scouting detail matters too, like talking to coaches, talking to players, understanding what's going on in their development, what have they improved on, what part of their skills, not just their skating, but what aspect of their skating is important. That matters. But I think your overall philosophy and how you approach your work as an evaluator is what drives value in terms of being able to identify and select NHL players.
And before we get into actually talking about NHL prospects, another quick question too is, the digital media landscape. There's so much content out there. There's an opportunity for a lot of things to be read in the NHL sphere as well with prospects. And what I find really interesting too, though, is people also want quick news. They want to kind of I still think there's a market for the thorough articles, the long articles, but people want quick news. They do want the hot takes. I just wanted your kind of opinion and your standpoint on the whole hot take, right? Like the little tweet, like Rasmus Dahlin, and then like a couple of points. That's it. Rather than reading a whole like novel, because there are people that like both, right? But like, I'm just curious to hear your perspective on that.
I'd say earlier in my career, I was much more quicker to react, and as I've kind of done this for a lot longer and gotten more experience, I've learned to be more reserved in how I use social media. Part of that is I work behind a paywall, and my opinion is my livelihood. So I like people to pay to read that opinion. But as well, you kind of learn what's valuable and what's not. I don't think, Rasmus Dahlin, for example, let's just use that. People know he's good. They've seen his name produced many times as the number one prospect leading to this year's draft. Me tweeting he's good is not going, or tweeting a highlight or tweeting a stat is not going to lend value to a reader. If I was to say something if I produce something that I think would be interesting that I wouldn't think would be relevant for an article, I would usually tweet that. But I try to use social media to one, promote my work, two, to engage with my readers, and three, to produce interesting information that I don't think would be useful for an article, whether it's a quick stat update or a GIF of a player I've been clipping or something along those lines. I'm skeptical of just saying so-and-so player scored or so-and-so player had a 3-point night or something like that, because that's not really valuable to what I do. I don't give prospect updates about just how players are producing. My job is to give an evaluation of a player. So I don't know if that's relevant. It just seems like that kind of stuff would just seem more like asking for retweets as opposed to really informing the public of how good a particular player is.
Mm-hmm. No, absolutely. And World Junior Hockey Championship wraps up. Canada wins their second gold medal in 9 years. Just a lot of players had great tournaments that we're going to remember. Now, the obvious ones, Casey Middlestat, Connor Timmins, Cale Makar, and then you look at Rasmus Dahlin and Lance Anderson. Like, those are the obvious ones. Were there some players in the World Junior Hockey Championship that you think were underappreciated or not talked about, that you were like, wow, like this guy played really well? Were there any players that like you kind of looked at and not that many people were talking about it, you were really impressed with, Corey?
I think, well, if you were really paying attention, you probably were talking about them. But one, I think Washington prospect Axel Jonsson-Fjällby had a really strong tournament. He was projected as a third, fourth liner, and he was for Sweden. But I thought he had a really good tournament. He was one of their better forwards. Um, he's got decent size, really high end speed, works his tail off. He scored several shorthanded goals and had several other shorthanded chances just through his sheer work ethic and his speed. And I don't think he's gonna be a scorer in the NHL, but I think there's ability there. I think he's got a little bit of touch, and I think he's a guy who may not have seemed like an NHL prospect maybe a few months ago, a year ago. But I think he definitely showed he has some merit there as an NHL prospect. In terms of others, I'm trying to think of. Um, that's one that stood out to me the most. Um, and on the Czech Republic, I mean, people knew who he was. People knew who Martin Necas was. He was 12th overall pick last year by Carolina. I believe it was 12th. But I mean, I was talking to NHL people there, and they said, like, if this is a redraft, he go top 5 right now. He was absolutely dynamic, just blow you away good. Elite speed, elite skill. He made Carolina's team briefly out of camp, and I think next year he's on the team, and he's going to be a really important player for that team for a very long time.
Yeah, absolutely. Staying with Czech Republic, Filip Zadina, it's kind of hard to say, but in your eyes, in your mind, do you kind of think that he, with his performance and how he's playing with Halifax, he's kind of like guaranteed himself, well, for sure the top 10, but like possibly top 5? Like, do you think that's something that people are talking about?
Yeah, I mean, you can go higher than that, honestly. It's not just the World Juniors because you don't want to just, evaluate a guy based on 2 weeks.
Oh,
But you
absolutely.
mentioned he's played Halifax. He's just been absolutely outstanding there. Just elite, elite talent, skates well, good shot, competes. I mean, he has every single tool you want, and he has the production to back it up too. I mean, for me, he's, just you could argue him at 3, you could argue him at 2 right now,
Yeah,
honestly. I mean,
like
he's a truly dominant kind of offensive player.
that's what I kind of look at. Svechnikov is fantastic, and I like the way he plays. I'm just wondering. I mean, people were saying 1 and 2, Dalian and Svechnikov. Zadina could maybe be number 2 in there. It could happen.
There's differences in their games. I would say Zadina has a little more skill. I think Svechnikov is very skilled, but I think Zadina just creates a little bit more with the puck. He's able to, get himself out of a little bit more trouble in tight spaces. Svechnikov, I think, is a better skater. He's more powerful. He is skilled and he has good vision, and he definitely can produce offense. But I think the difference between him is I think he's more powerful of a player in general.
Sticking with the 2018 NHL Draft, Brady Tkachuk is another player that has been talked about a lot. And what I find interesting about this one is people kind of had an idea based on watching him in the U18s that he was that kind of tough player to play against. Kind of getting in your face, but could definitely put the puck in the back of the net, make some good plays, a little bit of leadership there as well. Do you think it was do you think that Brady Tkachuk, well, first of all, how did you think his World Junior performance was? And, have you been following him at Boston University? Is he kind of solidifying himself as a top 10 pick in the NHL draft for sure?
Yeah, I think he's definitely going to go in the top 10. I've talked to some teams that have him like top 5. I think he's on the argument for top 3. I'm not sure if I'm quite there. I'm not sure the skill level is high end, but he did have a very good World Juniors. He was one of the better forwards, not only for Team USA, but you could argue in the tournament. Him and Casey Middlestad clicked very well. He's got skill. He's incredibly powerful. Like I've seen, it probably showed more from me actually in his game in college, where I've just seen him just bulldoze his way to the net, and he has this really elite power game where he can really just dominate physically. And he's like I said, but I think he's not just a bulldozer. He has skill. He has hockey sense. He skates okay. There's definitely a lot to like there. I think for sure he's going to be a top 10 pick right now.
You mentioned all the guys you mentioned, whether they have it or not. You mentioned the word skill a lot. Skill is something that obviously the NHL has become a more skilled game with guys like Connor McDavid and Auston Matthews coming in. Do you think that now? I'm just curious. Do you think that it's become more about skill rather than like what teams kind of the needs of a team, right? Like a team will draft, right? And a guy that will maybe be ranked like in the top 20, but they have the 12th pick, right? But there's a guy, they look at him and they need him, and it's like, a big mobile defenseman, and that's what they need. Do you think that there's still some teams that draft that way, or do you think it's like skill over everything these days? You take the best skill player available.
I think there are still teams that will look internally into the organization, whether it's on their NHL team or in their farm system, and they will factor that heavily into their decision making. That doesn't mean every team does it. It doesn't mean it's the only variable that they consider, but there are definitely teams that do that, and we've seen that in recent drafts. In my opinion, I think generally skill should win out. I mean, I think in my philosophy with the NHL draft and just prospects in general, is the number one goal of the draft is to find a star player, not just in the first round, but in every round. You can find your third line and fourth line forwards on the free agent market. You can't find a first line center on the free agent market. And that's, I think every single pick should be designed to try and find a guy who could be an impact player for your team for a very long time. I think there are some people who are very gung-ho about never drafting for need. And I think that can be a little misplaced in terms of their emotions in that matter, just because in reality, outside of like the top five, the difference between every pick is very marginal.
Yep.
The difference in value between the 19th best player and the 20th best player is very, very, very small.
Mm-hmm.
So if your top 7 young players in your organization are all defensemen, and there's a very, very small gap between the 19th best player, which is a defenseman, and the 20th, which is a forward, you could take the forward. Like, you're not losing a lot of value in that regard. But generally, I feel like you should be trying to target impact players.
Absolutely. I think we're gonna wrap up, but this is now your time to plug the Athletic. What kind of articles specifically? NHL prospect articles, but people subscribe to the Athletic. What can people expect from the work from Corey Pronman?
What I hope I can provide our customers at the Athletic is providing, objective opinions on NHL prospects. I try to make sure my opinions are not subject to bias by others. I take very much pride that I have an independent opinion, which can be good and bad at different times. But I go to a lot of hockey games. I watch a lot of hockey games, whether on the road or at home. I talk to a lot of people to try and find out the most I can about these NHL players or potential NHL players, and provide, I hope, good analysis on players who are drafted and draft eligible. And I hope our customers enjoy the work we do.
Perfect. Corey, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really, really appreciate it. Where can people follow you on Twitter if they don't already?
At Corey Pronman, all one word. And again, all my work is available at The Athletic.
Perfect. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
Yep, sure thing, Peter.
All right, this has been Popternative. You catch Peter Sensel's Popternative on YouTube. Subscribe on YouTube for the video version, iTunes, or wherever else you listen to podcasts for the audio-only versions, popternative.com for more content. Until next time, this is Peter Beats and Corey Pronman signing off.
Thank you for tuning in to Popternative. Make sure to check out our past episodes of Popternative on YouTube. Be sure to like Popternative on Facebook and follow us on Twitter.